Dear learners, I'm Christina Georgy. I welcome you to my session on the course code MEG-01 titled British Poetry. Dear learners, you are listening to part 2 of the already uploaded session on the most important topics to prepare for your MEG-01 TEE. So in our previous session, we discussed from blocks 1 to 6. We also looked at the previous TEE question papers and related questions with respect to blocks 1 to 6. So in this particular session, we'll focus our attention towards blocks 7 to 10 of the course code MEG-01, that is British Poetry. Moving on to block 7. See, block 7 is titled The Second Generation Romantic Poets, Shelley and Keats. So this is in fact the continuation of block 6, where we dealt with the basics of romanticism, and we also looked into two notable figures, Wordsworth and Coleridge, along with a special mention of William Blake. So here the focus would undoubtedly be towards Shelley and Keats. As part of this block, you have 5 units 31 to 35. Unit 31, titled The Volcanic Voice of Hope, deals with the life and works of P.B. Shelley. As much as I've observed, there hasn't been a specific question as such from Shelley, but you need to have an idea in order to write an introduction to Shelley when they ask you a question on the triumph of life. I've seen essay questions from this particular work. Nevertheless, there could also be questions on critical appreciation of this particular poem. For that matter, you need to study Unit 32. Unit 32 deals with discussions on the triumph of life. Do not forget to read the text. It is provided as part of the appendix. If you look into page number 100, you could see the entire text by P.B. Shelley. You need to have thorough understanding of the text in order to attempt the questions effectively. I'm referring to the questions on annotations, passages that you get as part of the first question. Units 33 and 34 deals with Keats and one particular work specifically titled Hyperion. It has also a subtitle, a fragment. So this is also a probable essay question. Please make sure that you prepare Keats' Hyperion too. Unit 35, you could have just a general understanding. You don't have to specifically prepare for your TEE as such. While you prepare for Hyperion as part of Unit 33, you need to have an understanding of the life and works of Keats, his poetic ambition, and also why Keats used Greek mythology in his writings. There could be a question on comparison of Hyperion with other long poems of the younger romantics too. For that matter, you need to be thorough with the textual aspects and also a critical summary of Hyperion. Remember, it is a political allegory. There could be a question likewise, and it is also a poem about poets and poetry. Uncertainties and negative capability could also be a question. Negative capability is a term coined by Keats. It's part of Unit 34. Make sure that you thoroughly study this unit. Now let's have a look at some of the previous questions with respect to this particular block. For the June 2018 TEE, there was a question: evaluate the triumph of life in the light of the opinion that Shelley achieves the sublime. So this is a question based on Unit 32. With respect to Shelley and triumph of life, we have already discussed how to frame your answers as part of the first part of this lecture. If you have not listened to that, make sure that you refer to that and come back to this for clarity. While you write this question, firstly you'll have to frame an introduction on romantic poetry. Thereafter you could mention the romantics, the first generation, second generation, and you can mention that Shelley is part of the second generation, and you could write a paragraph, life and works of Shelley. Thereafter, you can focus on this particular poem written by him, and you could write a brief critical summary, and according to the question, critically analyze this particular poem. And do not forget to mention some critical claims and conclude with a suitable conclusion. We've already discussed how to write an answer for an essay question on poetry. I don't want to repeat the whole thing. Please refer to the previous upload for that matter. There has been questions on Hyperion 2 essay questions, and also questions for critical appreciation. Make sure that you learn these units thoroughly. That's all regarding block 7. Comparatively, there wouldn't be many questions from block 7. But that's not the case with block 8. If you look at block 8, there could be multiple questions from this particular block titled The Victorian Poets. As the very title suggests, this block deals with the Victorian England and how poetry flourished during those times, with specific focus to some notable poets such as Robert Browning, the Rossettis, namely D.G. Rossetti and Christina Rossetti, and also focus is provided to Oscar Wilde. So there are also, you can see, 6 units as part of this particular block. The first unit, that is unit 36, gives you an overview of the Victorian age. Hence, you can read and have better understanding. You have already studied this for your BA days. Nevertheless, you need to study Robert Browning in detail. Here, focus should be provided to units 37 and 38 when you study Browning. His life and works, you need to have general understanding, but regarding his 2 early poems, you need to have clarity. 2 poems from Men and Women, that is a collection of work written by Browning, that is also suggested. These could be questions for critical appreciation and at times even for annotation. So, some poems such as Fra Lippo Lippi, then Porphyria's Lover, Sodallo, and others should be given focus. Let me remind you that Fra Lippo Lippi has been asked for many TEEs. So you need to study Fra Lippo Lippi in detail. You can also expect maybe an essay question from Unit 40. So thoroughly study Unit 40. Unit 41 deals entirely with Oscar Wilde. The Ballad of Reading Gaol is a specific text mentioned for study. Hence, there could be questions on Oscar Wilde. If you get such a question, make sure that you give a proper introduction to the Victorian poetry, and whatever you study as part of the introductory sessions, most important aspect should be mentioned. Then comes Oscar Wilde, his works, and specific focus on the Ballad of Reading Gaol. It could be an essay question, maybe, and it could also be part of critical appreciation for that matter. Remember to read the text given as part of appendix. It's okay even if you leave out supplementary readings. I'm very sure that not many of you would be interested, or rather would have enough time to read supplementary readings. Fine, but never ever leave out the poetry text, for there could be questions on annotations. With respect to this particular block, block 8, focus should be given to units 40 and 41. There could be a sure question on the pre-Raphaelites, and Oscar Wilde could also be asked for your TEE. Make sure that you study this block thoroughly with specific focus on the pre-Raphaelites and of course Oscar Wilde. When you study the pre-Raphaelites, pay specific attention to D.G. Rossetti. And one poem, The Blessed Damsel, would be more important. And Goblin Market is the poem mentioned in the text by Christina Rossetti. you may have a reading on the background as well, so that if there comes an essay question, you will be able to crack it effectively. Moving on to Oscar Wilde, I told you that there could be historical, biographical and ideological perspective based question too. Even if it is an essay question, make sure that you mention all the effective and essential aspects. Now let's look at some of the previous question papers. For the recent June 2022 TEE, there has been a question on the Pre-Raphaelites, that is from Block 8, Unit 40. Who were the Pre-Raphaelites? Examine the works of any one of the Pre-Raphaelite poets. See, here you will have to give a general introduction to Pre-Raphaelites, and from the many Pre-Raphaelite poets, you will have to focus your attention towards any one of them. So you could write on either of the Rossettis, but you will have more points to write about Dante Gabriel Rossetti. So there lies your smartness. When you are provided with chances to choose wisely. Then again, it's up to you. It's just a suggestion from my part. Speaking about Rossettis, there has been another question. For the June 2020 TEE, there was this question. Based on the blessed damsel, explain how Rossetti is concerned with the connection between physical world and the world of the afterlife. So this question is specifically based on D.G. Rossetti. There has been questions on Oscar Wilde too. I am focusing on the essay questions. We will separately discuss the critical appreciation questions towards the end of this session. So for the June 2018 TEE, there has been a question on Oscar Wilde. The question is like, Oscar Wilde's The Ballad of Reading Gaol suggests the futility of Christian ethics and laws of faith in Christianity. Illustrate with suitable examples from text. See, this is a tricky question. That is, you'll have to know the text thoroughly in order to attempt this question. You might have studied this part, Oscar Wilde, but if you have to score well, you'll have to even illustrate from the textbook. There lies the challenge. So when given such a choice, choose wisely. If you feel like you wouldn't be able to illustrate properly, go for a safer option. Dear learners, remember that you are provided with enough and more options for this particular course code. For this particular question paper, you have options. Make wise choices and use those choices properly in a way that you would score better. For that matter, you need to analyze the previous papers and plan your strategy. And also, once you receive the question paper, spend a few minutes to read the questions and plan your answers. You're free to write in any order you like, provided you put the correct question numbers. Remember to put the correct question numbers, or else you'll be in trouble. So make sure that you attempt that question which you're so sure of as the very first question. Of course, preferably write according to the order the question is given. But if you feel like you have a question that could certainly give you an impression in the minds of the examiner, go for it. But make sure that you put the correct question number. And like I discussed in my previous session, it would be ideal if you could manage the pages and the length of the answers so that you wouldn't be in any kind of trouble. Make sure that your answers are legible too. Alright, moving on to the next block, block 9. Dear learners, this block is of great importance to your study of poetry. This block is titled The Modernist Poets, Trust me when I say this, you could see the most number of questions in your question paper from this particular block. Hence, I would say this is one of the most important blocks with respect to your MEG-01 TEE preparation. For that matter, you have 6 different units within this particular block. The first unit, Unit 42, gives with an overview, an introduction to the modern British poetry. This unit, you need to have better clarity because it deals with how poetry evolved during the modernist era. It's very important. There you get fruitful information regarding Yeats and Irish poetry. This is important, for there will be many questions on W.B. Yeats. Thereafter, this unit discusses modernism with focus upon Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot. This also is an important aspect. Then you'll have to have an understanding of how poetry evolved and how it developed over the years during the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s and after. Please read and understand this particular unit. Only then will you be able to frame your answers on Yeats and Eliot. There will be more than 2 questions from this particular block. If you have a look into the previous question papers too, the most number of questions are most probably from this particular block. This deals with 2 modernist poets, namely W.B. Yeats and of course T.S. Eliot. And the specific work that we study as part of T.S. Eliot is The Waste Land. There has not been a question paper without a question on the wasteland, so that would undoubtedly be a short question for your TE. Before discussing T.S. Eliot and the wasteland, let's focus our attention towards Unit 43, where we see W.B. Yeats and his poetic career. In order to effectively attempt the essay questions from W.B. Yeats, you need to know the basics regarding his quest for Irishness, then his Ireland, his poetic career, and some works such as Adam's Curse and No Second Troy. As of a brief mention, you better read about how poetry, feminine beauty, and love are related to one another in Adam's Curse. Or you need to bring out the significance of Troy as a symbol in No Second Troy. And remember to read how magic and symbolism are related in Yeats' poetry. Hence, this unit 43, would give you a foundation to build your essay questions on the major poems by W.B. Yeats. There could be a question on Easter 1916 or Sailing to Byzantium. So make sure that you study Unit 44 thoroughly. Remember, there could also be a general question on W.B. Yeats. If so, you need to mention all these works and the specific aspects effectively. Do not forget to refer to the appendix. All these poems have been illustrated there, and only then we'll be able to attempt the passages if there is an annotation question. Lapis lazuli is also a very important poem. Make sure that you read that. There could be questions for annotation and even for critical appreciation. Alright? Now, moving on to the last 3 units. Units 45 to 47. These units deal with the wasteland. The wasteland is undoubtedly one of the most renowned and celebrated modernist poetry of the 20th century. Whenever we teach modernist poetry, even for the BA students, the wasteland is cited or quoted as if the quintessential example. Hence, there will be a question on the wasteland. It is always better if you could prepare your answers for writing an essay question on wasteland. If there is a question for your TEE on the wasteland, it would certainly be an essay question. But it has been observed that most of our learners find this particular poem, The Wasteland, quite difficult to comprehend and to frame answers effectively. For that matter, the general trend is that they leave this particular poem. Remember, without study, The Wasteland, you wouldn't complete your study of British poetry. Nevertheless, you need to work smart for your TEE. It's up to you. If you feel like this poem is slightly heavy for you, it's your choice, but it is certainly an important question for your TEE. My suggestion is to study at least an overview of the poem, so that if they ask you a compare and contrast question with respect to WB Yeats, you'll be able to attempt that question. From my observation, there has been multiple questions from this block, even for a single TEE. We'll discuss that when we look into the previous question papers. For that matter, you need to be thorough with at least Unit 45, which discusses the theme and art of this particular poem. The composition, the publication details, the form, the poet's vision, and even the sections. There are 5 sections to this particular poem. I hope you remember. All these aspects you need to keep in mind. Section by section interpretation has been given as part of this unit. You need to make sure that you read, so that if there is an annotation question, you'll be able to attempt it. And while attempting the annotation question, you need to mention that this is from this section of this poem. The last 2 units, units 46 and 47, gives you the detailed interpretations of all the 5 sections. Make sure that you refer to the appendix 2. And if you are studying this, The Wasteland, this poem, seriously for your TEE, make sure that you prepare an outline for the essay question too. Then adapt with respect to the specific question in your question paper. That will make your task much more easy. Now let's focus our attention towards some of the previous question papers from this particular block, that is block 9. Dear learners, let me remind you that these are not all the previous papers and related questions. These are some of the previous questions. It's always important to refer to as many previous papers as you can, for if luck favors you, you will see similar questions or maybe the same questions. So do not limit your learning just to the questions that I discussed. There are many other question papers. If you could access them, please do refer to them, and that will certainly aid your exam preparation. Now, there has been questions related to The Wasteland for the December 2021 TEE. One question was to attempt an analysis of Eliot's poetic vision in The Wasteland. So here you will have to generally start with an introduction to botanist poetry, a very brief introduction where you mention Eliot, Yeats, Pound and all other important figures, and move on to T.S. Eliot, focus on his life and works. Then his poetic vision should be elaborated and substantiate with respect to The Wasteland, provided you give a brief introduction to Wasteland and thereafter illustrate with suitable examples. It would be wonderful if you could quote from the text, but it is not mandatory. Remember, if you plan to quote from the text, make sure that those lines are correct and enclosed within quotes. Now, for the same exam, December 2021 TEE, there has been another compare and contrast level question. Bring out the imagist elements in Eliot and Pound. See, if this question comes, I'm very sure you will have understanding on Eliot. But what about Pound? Unless you read the first unit of this block, you wouldn't have sufficient information regarding Pound. So hence, almost all the units in this particular block is important. That is the reason why I told you this is undoubtedly one of the most important blocks with respect to your TEE preparation. Now, there has been a question on Yeats 2 for the December 2021 TEE. What do you think is W.B. Yeats' contribution to modern poetry? See, I told you there could be a general question too. For that matter, the same introduction to modernism, how Yeats contributed his life and works, and how poetry evolved within his hands and the chief works, and make sure that you mention all the important works and at least some critical aspects with respect to these works. Even critical views from other writers, I'm referring to poets and critics, can be mentioned. Regarding Yeats, there has been questions for the June 2020 TEE2. There was this question, comment on Yeats' use of theatrical metaphor in his poetry. It was an essay question, so you'll have to mention the aspect of theatrical metaphor. Not just that, even if the question hasn't specifically mentioned, you will have to illustrate with examples from the texts, the poems that you have studied. So this is a bit challenging to score, but if you plan in advance, this will be very easy for you. I also told you there could be questions on the imagist elements. If you look into the June 2020 TEE, there has been this question, bring out the imagist elements in T.S. Eliot with reference to the wasteland. You'll have to quote and write with illustrations for this particular essay question. Another question was to examine the use of myth and symbolism in Eliot's Wasteland. For June 2020 TEE, this was a question. So you'll have to elaborate on these aspects, myth and symbolism. What is symbolism in modernist poetry? How is that aspect significant? All such details should be elaborated in this particular answer. There has been another question on Yeats. How are magic and symbolism connected in Yeats' poetry? This has been a question for the June 2022, a very recent TEE. So symbolism, you'll have to at least write for a paragraph. You'll have to study thoroughly. So moving on to some of the earlier question papers, write a critique of W.B. Yeats as a romantic poet. That has been a question for 2018 June TEE. Students, make sure that you read the question thoroughly before start planning your answers. Very often students make mistakes. They leave out certain points or certain aspects. Okay, close reading is very important. Discuss Yeats' use of history in either Easter 16 or Lapis Lazuli. This has been a question for the June 2011 TEE. Remember, with respect to those previous papers, around 10-year prior papers, the structure has changed, but the questions could be repeated. So make sure that you are aware of all these things. We have already discussed in detail the question pattern and question structure. Please refer to that if you are not aware of these aspects. For the June 2010 TEE, there has been a question to offer an analytical comment on Sailing to Byzantium. See, here a specific work is given and they haven't mentioned from which blog or from which poet this is mentioned. So here comes the challenge. You will have to identify the title of the poem, identify the poet, identify the era, and then start planning your answer. So Sailing to Byzantium is undoubtedly a poem by W.B. Yeats, modernist poetry. So when you critically comment on this poem, you will have to bring in all those modernist aspects, and even if not mentioned specifically, you will have to illustrate with references to the text of the poem. For the June 2010 TE, there has also been a question on discuss the wasteland as a poem about the 20th century concerns. Wow, that would be a much more easier question for you. You can elaborate on all the various aspects. For that matter, you'll have to have idea on the background too. Dear learners, from all these previous questions, we could analyze that there has been multiple questions with respect to this block. Hence, it would be a wise decision not to leave this block 9 entirely. I'm emphasizing on this aspect just because I understand that the general understanding among the students is that there would be one essay question from one block. Dear ones, it's not always like that. There are multiple probabilities from block 9. Hence, being your academic counselor, my humble suggestion is not to leave out this block entirely. You should be thorough with either Yeats or Eliot. Remember, there could be compare and contrast questions too. So, it would be wise to study this block thoroughly, but even if not, never ever leave this entire block with respect to your TEE. So if you could analyze the previous question papers, as I mentioned, for the last June 2022 TEE, there has been 3 questions from block 9. Remember, a total of 5 essays you will have to attempt. One among them could certainly be annotation. Out of the 4 questions, 3 could be on block 9. See, among those 3 questions, 2 were from Yeats and 1 was from Eliot. For December 2021 also, there has been 3 questions from block 9, 1 from Yeats and 2 from Eliot. See, there has been recurring in the question type, and you never know, maybe you could see similar questions from the past, as I mentioned. Remember, if you attempt all the 3 questions from one particular block, there could be challenges with respect to your answering pattern or the way you answer. There could be repetitions, and it wouldn't always leave a good impression in the minds of the evaluators. So my suggestion would be not to write all your answers from one entire block. That is, even if you see 3 questions from the same block, make sure that you choose just 2 maximum, because you could present variety in your answers and freshness in your answers only if you write from various aspects, right? Yes, but this has been the trend. It could always change. Never ever believe that, alright, I should follow the trend and study only selected parts. That would never be a wise choice. Of course, you are free to leave, but it's up to you. That's a risk that you take. Unless your answers are different from others, how would you score better than the others? Think positively and critically. Wise choices should be made. Without much ado, let's move on to the last block, block 10. Dear ones, never ever leave out this block just because this is the last one. This is a significant block with respect to your TEE. This is a continuation of block 9. In fact, it deals with some of the postmodernist poets. So this block is titled Some Modernist and Postmodernist Poets, Dylan Thomas, Philip Larkin and Sylvia Plath. So here you have 5 units. The first 3 units are of great importance. I would say unit 50 would be the most important unit with respect to this particular block. We'll come to that. Before that, focus on Dylan Thomas, unit 48. There could be annotation questions with respect to Poem in October, Fern Hill and others. It's very unlikely to ask an essay question from Dylan Thomas as such. Nevertheless, there could be general essays regarding postmodernist poetry. If so, you will have to mention all the 3 of them elaborately. Otherwise, you will just have to understand his poetic works and prepare for the critical appreciation of such poems. Now, unit 49 is much more important because it deals with a movement poet, that is Philip Larkin. You need to know what movement poetry is, the origin of movement poetry. There could be even an essay question. And as a reactionary movement, how this poetry reacted to Eliot and Pound and to Dylan Thomas and others. Study the new manifesto, the role of the poet, and others. You'll have to have detailed understanding of poems such as I Remember, I Remember. Mr. Bleaney has been questioned for critical analysis. I've also seen questions on the Wits and Weddings. Church Going is a very popular poem. I'm very sure some of you must have studied this even at school. So most probably this could be a question for critical appreciation. If not, there could be, I see a probability of even an essay question because of movement poetry mentioned here. Nevertheless, as I mentioned, there could be a general essay. But the focus should be placed on Sylvia Plath. You could certainly expect at least one question on Sylvia Plath. Whenever you mention Sylvia Plath, make sure that you mention Confessional School of Poetry. Confessional School of Poetry, its beginnings, then origins, and how suicide, death, and disease play crucial aspects in such poems, and the contemporary others with respect to Sylvia Plath should be mentioned, and her life and works should be thoroughly studied. With respect to her works, the Colossus should be studied, Lady Lazarus and Daddy should be given prominence. These three would be the most significant works. The other poems such as Parda should also be mentioned. If there is a general essay with respect to Sylvia Plath, all the 5 works, if possible other works should also be mentioned. At least you will have to study the Colossus, Daddy, and Lady Lazarus. A detailed study is what I am intending at. Alright, Sylvia Plath is very important. The rest of the 2 units you can just read and understand. Even if they ask you, there wouldn't be specific questions as such. So, let's conclude with a short reference to the previous questions from this particular blog. As I told you, there has always been questions on Sylvia Plath. To be very honest, there has been repeated questions. So I'll just read out one question that has been repeated for many TEs. Show how death and suicide are important themes in Plath's poems. It has been a question for the June 2020 TE. Here, it's a general question. Plath's poems. So all the poems mentioned in your study material should be acknowledged and mentioned. Preferably, you could also quote and write, because Sylvia Plath, you can already prepare your answers. So great importance. And there has been questions like trace the development of Plath's persona from a submissive woman into a raging for revenge. So this has been a question for the June 2011 TEE. Yeah. There has been this question, write a critical comment on modernism in English poetry. This you could expect. If at all there happens such a question, you need to mention the modernist poets too. So that would be a very rich content if presented appropriately. A score in one also, but make sure that you refer to the poems and write. But it could be time consuming. Plan your time according. Time management is very crucial. And before concluding this session, let me also help you with some of those poems that are constantly asked for critical appreciation. We'll start off with the June 2022 TEE. There has been questions on Goblin Market. I told you it is a poem by Christina Georgy, the pre-Raphaelite movements. Then Lapis Lazuli, I also mentioned that when I mentioned W.B. Yeats. That has been asked. It is of great importance. With respect to Philip Larkin, I remember has been asked for 2021 December TEE. There has been a question to write a critical appreciation on the Ballad of Reading Gaol. Remember Oscar Wilde? Yes, that has been asked. For the June 2020 TEE, the Triumph of Life from Romantic Poets. So Shelley, that has been asked. In the same year, the next option was Hyperion. Keats Hyperion. See? Yes, so all these are seminal works. And for the 2018 TEE Child Harold has been asked. Even there was a question on Mr. Bleeny from the modernist poets. In the same question paper, the other option was the Colossus, Sylvia Plath. And there has even been a question on a validation forbidden mourning. See, all of us must have studied this as part of your BA days. At times, you never know. They could also ask you easy questions. So, never underestimate any piece of work in your syllabus or your study material for that matter. There could be questions from anywhere. So, if you prepare effectively, for that matter, if you plan effectively, this would be a piece of cake for you with a minimum bit of sincere effort, smart work from your part, and with the input that I provide you, you will certainly be able to pass your TEE on MEG-01 at the very first attempt itself. Remember, if there is a will, there is certainly a way. On that note of optimism, let me conclude this session for you. All those interested learners may refer to my playlist on MEG-01 in order to get related lectures on topics with respect to MEG-1 and also MEG-5 titled Literary Criticism and Theory. Before concluding, let me remind you that these are just my suggestions and my analysis. Question pattern could change. So always be prepared. Always remember that revision is a crucial aspect in your TEE preparation. Unless you revise and re-revise, you wouldn't be thorough enough with all the topics. That's all for today. I hope this session was interesting and useful to you. I wish you all the very best for your TEE preparation. You'll do well. Thank you so much for joining me today. We'll meet again soon with interesting, useful lectures related to your study topics. Till then, take care and thanks for listening.